Clint Calvert is our church leadership catalyst from the Minnesota-Wisconsin Baptist Convention. Now, when Minnesota-Wisconsin would come to our BGCT meetings, they would bring apples and cheese. Did you happen to bring any today?
Not survive the trip. Southwest Airlines only allows 2 checked bags, and really wasn't enough room for
Those were the days when you could bring a lot.
for the papers and the...
Last year Clint was going to be with us and he became ill and he wasn't able to be here. So Clint's topic today is Harrison Paradox Theory Application for Ministry Guidance Professionals.
So we're going to pass these this way. Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here, especially to be with a former teacher of mine, Dr. Hancock. Thank you. So as a clinical...
logs and people around here.
Yeah. As a clinical pastoral educator, I utilize Dan Harrison's paradox theory to assess students for learner readiness, goal setting, measuring progress, and career placement. I will explain paradox theory, demonstrate its applications for clinical pastoral education, and describe additional applications beneficial to ministry guidance professionals and the students they serve. My experience in taking the Harrison assessment: after taking the Harrison assessment in June of 2020, I studied its origin, its methodology, and applications. I was impressed with how the Harrison assessment revealed flaws in my decision-making processes. The assessment portrayed that I have a high preference for taking risk and a low preference for analyzing the pitfalls in a particular course of action. I also learned that my desire for decision-making authority is higher than the value I place on the opinions of others when making decisions. When these tendencies combine, I tend to make poor decisions by not considering what could go wrong and not deciding with the benefit of the insights of others. Enlightened with this realization, I've asked my coworkers to help me identify situations where these tendencies are contributing to poor decision making. I was also impressed with how the assessment pointed to my potential success and fulfillment as an educator. While I've experienced a good deal of assessment over the years, including DISC, StrengthsFinder, Ministry Insights, Myers-Briggs, Giant, Enneagram, and Hogan assessment, none of these tools resonated with me to the extent that the Harrison assessment did. The insights regarding my decision-making provided by assessment fueled my curiosity to become trained to debrief and coach others with this tool. Since earning my certifications in employee development and coaching debriefing from Harrison Assessment International in 2021, I've conducted 200 debriefings. I continue to be impressed with the feedback I hear from people who take the Harrison Assessment. Participants state that the assessment describes them well and gives them specific guidance for personal and professional development. The development of Dan Harrison's paradox theory. Dan Harrison developed the paradox theory with predictive analytics to recruit, develop, train, and lead talent. His theory, expressed in the Harrison assessment, furnishes ministry guidance professionals with a set of tools designed to promote self-awareness and career guidance for students. Harrison asserts, quote, "You will have a genuine strength if you are strong in both sides of a paradoxical pair. For example, being both frank and diplomatic is more likely to achieve the goal of getting one's communication across." Close quote. He continues, quote, "The paradox is two ideas that may appear contradictory, but are in fact both true. For example, sometimes less is more seems contradictory, but most people have experienced that fewer words sometimes communicate more effectively." Close quote. Dan Harrison created his assessment from his eclectic educational background and assessment experiences. He's the founder of Harrison Assessments and the originator of the paradox technology as used by Harrison Assessments. His diverse background in mathematics, personality theory, counseling psychology, and organizational psychology has enabled him to make a unique and exceptional contribution to assessment methodology. His website defines what the assessments are and do. The assessments are an online profiling tools that employers use to gain insight into the work preferences and behavioral profile of prospective employees. The reports analyze a variety of personality traits, interests, and work and task environment preferences. These assessments shed light on the potential value for employers and employees in talent development. Harrison's industry-leading SMART questionnaire measures 175 workplace factors and enables the effective measurement of leadership paradoxes, emotional intelligence, personality, motivation, attitudes, passion for specific jobs, engagement and retention, all in one high-tech 25-minute questionnaire. Philosophical foundations for the Harrison paradox theory. And I'll say parenthetically that when I was studying this, that my executive director offered to get me a job with the Methodist if I kept talking about this. Harrison describes the philosophical foundations of the Harrison paradox theory as an extension of Carl Jung's paradox theory. Both Jung and Freud recognize that the human mind is based on opposite forces. Paradox theory extends that principle to include complementary and paradoxical forces and applies them to specific traits. Paradox theory includes a series of principles that can be applied to the individual psyche as well as to organizational dynamics. Jung's interest in yin-yang theory informed Jung's paradox theory. Harrison explains, paradox theory is actually an application of psychology to yin-yang theory, which Carl Jung extensively studied in developing his own theories. This section related to yin-yang theory is included as a point of interest and further explores the philosophical assumptions behind paradox theory. Yin-yang theory comes from I Ching, a book of Chinese mystical philosophy. Harrison elaborates. In the Western way of thinking, yin-yang theory would appear to be a combination of theoretical physics, philosophy, and psychology. The primary source of yin-yang theory comes from the Chinese book I Ching. Harrison's logic for acceptance of the theory follow. Western science is based on observing specific aspects of life and attempting to isolate factors relative to a specific phenomenon. Yin-yang theory is also based on principles of observation. However, instead of attempting to isolate factors, it attempts to identify universal factors. Yin-yang theory identifies universal, observable principles of nature that apply equally to diverse fields, including physics, medicine, and psychology. Harrison explains how paradoxes help people identify their strengths. According to paradox theory, our lives involve dealing with a series of paradoxes. Each paradox is a relationship between two categories of traits. One trait is a gentle trait, while the other is the dynamic trait. Each of the 12 pairs of the paradoxical traits is portrayed on an XY graph in order to depict the relationship between the paradoxical traits. The area within the XY graph is divided into 4 quadrants. Each relationship is represented by a quadrant that identifies the trait associated with that relationship. The person's score is represented by a red dot. The surrounding shaded area represents his or her typical range of behavior. The Harrison assessment captures the degree to which a person values one trait relative to another. Harrison asserts that by measuring traits and organizing them according to the paradoxical model, we gain insight into the manner in which each person manages each paradox. Thus, we gain a wealth of understanding about an individual's behavior pattern that is well beyond the traditional bipolar system of measurement. The goal of the theory is to help a person taking the assessment to see the mutual compatibility of the seemingly contradictory traits. The term paradox theory is used because complementary traits appear to be contradictory. But in fact, they're not. A person who embraces only one side of the paradox will consider the traits to be contradictory or opposite. However, a person who has psychologically resolved a paradox will consider the pair of traits to be mutually compatible. In addition, such a person will exhibit a greater range of behavior, resulting in greater effectiveness and a greater sense of personal fulfillment. The interpretation of the paradox report of the Harrison assessment begins with an explanation of paradoxical traits. A paradox is two ideas that may appear contradictory that are in fact both true. For example, sometimes less is more seems contradictory, but most people have experienced that fewer words can sometimes communicate more effectively. Balanced paradoxes are celebrated for using both traits to synergistic advantage. You'll have a genuine strength if you're strong on both sides of a paradoxical pair. Out of balance paradoxes are explained. When one trait is significantly stronger than the other, it's considered out of balance. A person with this configuration tends to rely on the strong trait even when the other trait would be more effective as an appropriate response. As a result, the perceived or assumed strength is a derailer. Flip behaviors happen when behaviors control the person rather than the person controlling the behavior. Harrison paradox theory states that when we have an out of balance paradox and we are under stress, we flip to the opposite of our normal behavior. Harrison paradox theory applied to clinical pastoral education learning objectives. As a CPE student, I recognize the potential applications of the report to help me achieve CPE learning objectives. As a CPE supervisor educator, I use the Harrison Assessment Paradox reports for student interviews, goal setting, individual supervision, understanding group dynamics and group supervision, and measuring student progress from the beginning of their CPE training and at the end. The individual paradox reports and team paradox reports give me and my students a shared understanding and vocabulary of our traits, preferences, and tendencies. Several of the 12 paradoxes measured by the Harrison Assessment relate to CPE objectives and the goals articulated by the Integrated Developmental Model. The Integrated Developmental Model describes the goal of supervision in 4 phases. The assessment provides clarity for the student in setting and achieving CPE learning goals. Students have a more accurate understanding of themselves and their areas of growth due to taking the assessment. If all the students in the group take the Harrison Assessment, they are exposed to paradox theory. The students have shared vocabulary for discussing their tendencies and the tendencies of others. The paradoxes most applicable to CPE are insightful curiosity, self-actualization, respectful candor, equity mindset, and coaching mindset. Insightful curiosity is the tendency to explore different viewpoints and make conclusions. Insightful curiosity is composed of the tendencies certain and open reflective. Certain is the tendency to feel confident in one's own opinions. Open reflective is the tendency to reflect on many different viewpoints. Insightful curiosity relates to the CPE objective to explore one's theological heritage and impact it has on one's pastoral ministry. Insightful curiosity relates to the IDM. The supervisee is able to reflect appropriately on his or her theology and is able to identify a personal metaphor or model of pastoral care. Self-actualization is the tendency to expand our self-awareness and capabilities through self-appreciation and the intention to improve. Self-actualization is composed of the tendencies self-acceptance and self-improvement. Self-actualization relates to the CPE objective to develop self-awareness about how one's beliefs, attitudes, strengths, limitations, values, and assumptions affects one's pastoral ministry. Self-actualization relates to the IDM. Supervisee is aware of self and how to use self in pastoral care situations, aware of transference, countertransference, and parallel process issues. Respectful candor is the tendency to communicate in a respectful and straightforward manner. This paradox is composed of the tendencies frank and diplomatic. Respectful candor relates to the CPE objective to develop the capacity to use one's personal and pastoral leadership and authority. Respectful candor relates to the IDM. Supervisee is able to establish a meaningful pastoral bond with individuals, knowing when it is appropriate to confront, support, or seek clarification. Equity mindset is the tendency to assert one's needs and respond to others' needs. This paradox is composed of the tendencies assertive and helpful. Equity mindset relates to the CPE objective to develop self-awareness and how one's beliefs, attitudes, strengths, limitations, values, and assumptions affect one's pastoral ministry. Equity mindset relates to the IDM. Supervisee is aware of self and how to use self in pastoral care situations, being aware of transference, countertransference, and parallel process issues. Coaching mindset is a tendency to be warm, empathetic, and to hold others accountable. This paradox is composed of the tendencies enforcing and warmth, empathy. Coaching mindset relates to the CPE objective to utilize individual and group supervision for personal and professional growth and the capacity to evaluate one's ministry. Coaching mindset relates to the IDM, demonstrates increasing ability to use individual and group supervision for personal and professional growth and development. The paradox report from Harrison Assessment also informs my supervisory style. My paradox reports are that I tend to be self-critical and I can become defensive. My communication style is forthright diplomacy, but I may occasionally be evasive, or blunt. I moderately put forward my own needs. I tend to be helpful and conscious of others' needs. My creative initiatives typically come to fruition. I tend to enforce rules with compassion. My desire for decision-making authority is stronger than my willingness to collaborate. My self-understanding makes me aware of tendencies that support and derail my pastoral supervision. The Harrison Assessment provides an interesting means of comparing out and describing outcomes. So I've included a figure here that shows the comparison of a CPE student's results from taking a Harrison Assessment at the start of the 100 unit and one taken at the conclusion of the 400 unit. I have utilized Harrison Assessment as pre and post measures for Doctor of Ministry projects that I've chaired at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary as well. Now there's a clinical example here in the paper I'm going to omit in the interest of time. This would have been a lot of fun. This was going to be a verbatim that I was going to have two of you read to each other, but I think we've been given quite enough context to continue this. So I'm going to resume this with a pastor search committee uses Harrison Assessment job success formula. One of the great joys of my life was serving as transitional pastor at Journey Church, Amory, Wisconsin, from November of 2022 through August of 2023. Journey Church is a creative and active congregation filled with believers who are serving their community and going on mission trips across the United States. As transitional pastor, I met with the elders, I preached 3 of 4 Sundays, and assist the church's pastor search committee. The pastor search committee agreed early in their process to utilize Harrison Assessment to help them with their search. I've been trained to use this assessment to help churches identify suitable candidates to consider. The pastor search process is a spiritual discernment experience. I stressed to the members of the committee that the Holy Spirit would lead them to call their next pastor. They would not be relying on the Harrison Assessment to make their choice. However, the assessment would serve as a tool to help the committee clarify their expectations and set criteria important for the church in considering who to call. The pastor search committee met and reviewed a set of eligibility and suitability factors. The eligibility factors were education, experience, and other expectations required for the position. The suitability factors were the traits and preferences the church most valued in their lead pastor. After considering the traits most valued, the committee put the traits in order of their preference, and I used the Harrison Assessment Enterprise System to develop a job success formula. Journey Church values a lead pastor who loves to teach and is highly relational. The job success formula expressed these as the most essential traits valued by the church, along with a dozen other criteria that the pastor search committee considered vital to the fit of the role of lead pastor. The essential traits were helpful, teaching, warmth, empathy, cause-motivated, takes initiative, diplomatic, enthusiastic, influencing, optimistic, persistence, and wants challenge. The desirable traits included collaborative, enlists cooperation, wants to lead, manages stress well, organized, authoritative, open, reflective, planning, pressure tolerance, self-acceptance, analyze pitfalls, and self-improvement. Traits to avoid included defensive, blunt, dogmatic, forceful enforcing, and harsh. The committee agreed that the candidates would take the Harrison Assessment as part of the search process and that they would take the results into their spiritual discernment of who to call. On July 30th, 2023, Isaac Karpinski, whose suitability score was 95%, accepted the unanimous call of Journey Church to serve as lead pastor. The leadership of the Holy Spirit was evident throughout the process, as first the pastor search committee was unanimous in their recommendation of Isaac to Journey's elders. The elders interviewed Isaac at length and were unanimous in their recommendation of Isaac to the church. I was delighted when the church unanimously affirmed their support of Isaac's new ministry as lead pastor of Journey Church. The Harrison Assessment played a key role in Journey Church's discernment of Isaac's call. The process helped clarify the church's expectations. Isaac's results in taking the assessment characterized him as an ideal candidate for the church to consider. The church valued both the desire to teach and a desire to relate in their lead pastor. Isaac loves to teach and to relate to people, and this was evident not only by his assessment, but also in his successive interviews with the committee elders in the church. What's good for the institution and good for the minister? Over the past few years, I've debriefed many Harrison assessments with ministers. I recently compiled 25 reports from ministers residing in the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin to consider similarities and differences in this group of 25 participants. Of the 25 participants I selected, I observed that these ministers tend to prefer to help others more than to assert their own needs, to maintain warm relationships more than hold others accountable, to make decisions based on logic more than on intuition, and to achieve more than to focus on managing stress. None of these preferences are wrong. When I debrief a Harrison assessment, I remind participants that I'm a tour guide and not a judge. Institutions appreciate ministers who are helpful, empathetic, logical, and achieving. And all these traits that this group of ministers prefer are good for the institution. The question that I raise with ministers is, are these traits valued by your institution in balance with other traits that are good for you? For ministers to thrive, they need to consider and make time for their needs and the needs of their family. Church members need to accept training and responsibility for shared ministry. Ed Stetzer frequently says that facts are our friends. Well, many decisions in life require the use of intuition as well. Without adequate self-care, even a high achiever cannot maintain productivity for long. My friend Jack Bell is fond of saying, when your output exceeds your input, your upkeep will become your downfall. This maxim is a great reminder for ministers to balance their preferences for sustainable, fruitful ministry. Institutional stakeholders can encourage their ministers to be realistic when setting deadlines, to take time to care for themselves, to invite the intuition of others, and to clarify expectations for ministry leaders. This way, the needs of both are met, what is good for the institution and what is good for the minister. One of my CPE students was chosen by his institution to be a model employee on which to base a suitability formula. His suitability factors for his role were so high that his administration told me to use him as a model for new hires when constructing a job success formula for the organization. At the beginning of the 100 CPE unit, I constructed the formula based on institutional input, and the student took the Harrison assessment. His results indicated his suitability percentage was a 94% fit for the job as described by the formula. 13 months later, he completed the 400 course in CPE. He retook his Harrison assessment so we could do a pre and post CPE analysis of his preferences. Astonishingly, his preference for self-acceptance measured more than 3.4 points higher than his 100 course assessment on a 1 to 10 scale. Also of interest was he was marginally less suitable, 91%, for the role he modeled for his institution. When I reported these results to his administration with the student's permission, I commented, he may be slightly less suitable for the role now, but he is more sustainable as a person in this role. His suitability for the role is only of value to the institution if he is physically present and spiritually resilient to accomplish his role. Conclusion. The Harrison paradox theory and applications realized from using the Harrison assessment make specific contributions to clinical pastoral education. The assessment furnishes the ministry guidance professional with a versatile toolbox for recruiting, developing, managing, and retaining ministers. The use of the assessment saves me time by giving me a means of learning more about my students in a concentrated debriefing. The results give me a shared vocabulary with which to converse with my students, and I can provide value to other organizations by helping them recruit more suitable candidates. The Harrison assessment gives me a way to describe student tendencies at the beginning and the end of a program. I'm fond of saying, your mileage may vary. However, my mileage with the Harrison assessment has made my instructional journey as a CPE educator, a church consultant, and a pastoral caregiver more efficient and effective. Thank you.
Wow. Questions? I'll throw this in. One of my favorite texts is Tim Elmore's 8 Paradoxes of Great Leadership, and I did not know about this. And my students love the paradox because they're both. And This is just fascinating to me.
Well, I think so, and I hope you'll ask questions, because I'm a much better question answerer than I am a reader, so seriously, yeah.
What's the cost involved?
There's a retail cost per unit or per report. So a paradox report would cost about $114 for the retail cost of the report. That does not include what debriefing would cost if someone provided the debriefing time. But there's also wholesale costs. And that's what we got into with the convention. Rather than pay someone else to do the debriefing, I became accredited to do it, and then we were able to buy ours at wholesale. And so my cost per unit is about $27. So whatever 27 times 3 would be for a paradox report. Yeah.
So what training was involved in you being able to do that?
So it's about 12 hours of asynchronous training where you study the paradox theory and how to debrief it, and then you have to give a debriefing with a qualified reviewer who checks to see that your language is correct. Essentially, they don't want you to stray too far from the technicalities of the report, and so that's what they're trying to get you to, as quality control, to make sure you're saying what Dan Harrison would say about your report.
How long has this assessment been out?
I don't know how many years it's been in effect. I know it's used all over the world. I know it's, I want to say 75 languages, but it's got a significant track record.
Yeah, I would like you to comment because I find it very, very intriguing. The model student, the fact that he was less suitable for the role, but then you pointed out more sustainable as a person in the role.
Yes.
Could you say a little more about that?
Well, honestly, every time you change the suitability factors in the job success formula, you could change the number. So if you say these are the essential qualities I want, and you force rank them on a weighted scale, I want my person to be this, this, and this, and you put so much weight on that. Anytime you adjust those factors, your score outcome would be different because you've weighted the factors differently. Okay, we used exactly the same set of factors, and they do change. So if they recommend that you take the assessment about every 2 years to see kind of how things are changing. Okay, but again, institutional priorities can change, right? The person themselves can change. There's a lot of sort of variables, and so I want to be very careful in my use of language that this is a snapshot of the person on the day that they took it. It does have a reliability percentage where it measures the consistency and self-awareness of the person taking it, so you get a reliability score. I won't debrief anybody that has less than an 80%, because that indicates that they fundamentally misunderstood some things about the report. It's interesting to me that younger adults tend to score lower in the reliability percentage. I suspect it's because these young people are tested all the time, and when they're taking this, they may be trying to force an outcome. And so I want to, I will be generous with people when they're on that 80% line, because the younger the people tend to be, the harder to get higher scores. Yeah. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. I'm kind of all over the place. Yeah. I would just say I've completely drunk the Kool-Aid on this, 100%. But I get so much out of it. I get to use it every single day. In fact, I debriefed 3 people on Monday in the hotel that are CPE students for someone else's program. And I just love it so much because once you have that data, so we'll take everybody in that group with their permission, of course. Let's say there's 7 or 8 people in the group. We can plot them on a team paradox, and we can talk about how group dynamics can be affecting group supervision. So.
How much coaching do you do with institutions? Because I can imagine sitting with churches or hospitals going like, yeah, we don't really care if they self-actualize. We don't really care if they stress manage.
Right.
We need them to preach good and show up.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I feel like as a chaplain, my responsibility is to advocate a little bit for that minister, right? To say, I appreciate your institutional concern, but really it is in your best interest for them to be sustainable. So, yeah, of course you want that person to be warm. You want them to be helpful. You want them to be all those things. But if they're not going to be there because they can't set a boundary, so that's kind of the debate that we have. But at the end of the day, it's the institution owns the suitability factors. It's theirs, and it changes with every group I work with. They have a different idea, kind of about what they want. Yeah.
That's too much.
At what point in ministry training does this kind of assessment become viable or useful? You know, if you're training undergraduates, it doesn't seem like for a freshman it would really be that useful. So, in your opinion?
Sure. And I don't mean to contradict you, but I'm thinking of something else. Harrison assessment data can be applied to all kinds of reports. So the most useful place for the undergraduate would be in career options. So they take all that data and they can give you a list of options for careers that you would be fulfilled in. Now, people can do anything they want to, but Harrison says if you're 80% or more in this career options report, you're 3 times more likely to be fulfilled and successful in that career. So I've seen it where I've given a young person was in college, probably the wrong audience to tell the story to, but they were in college and they did their assessment, their career options came back, human service, working with my hands, human service, working with my hands. So all of those top careers were a variation of those two. So after our discussion, he decided to go to trade school and leave college. And he was much more satisfied and fulfilled, right? So I can see at an undergraduate level that they're having difficulty discerning a call, they're having difficulty choosing ministry as a vocation. This would give you a sense of whether they're called, and there are actually jobs in there, director of religious activities, there's 2 or 3 that are modeled for ministry. Now you would have to absolutely customize it for your institution, the outcomes you would want. But I think that would be intensely helpful for college students trying to, am I in the right major? Am I, those kinds of questions to settle that.
But that's interest, not aptitude.
Okay, so yes, and I want to be even more precise. It's what they perceive as their preference and their trait, right? It's not an objective evaluation of their skill. It's what they want to be.
So kind of like the old strong vocational interest blank. Tons of possibilities, and it measures where your interest lies that you might not even recognize. But it does not tell me if I can do those.
It's hilarious, but I see a lot of these that come back where their number one career fulfilling thing would be disc jockey. And that sounds ridiculous, but hey, who wouldn't love to be, anyway, I'm sorry, that happens to be one of mine. But the point is that it points to potential things maybe they hadn't considered, right? And so like the thing with, I never thought about this before, that I could be, leave college and go to trade school, and what's so interesting about that is, it's like Habitat for Humanity or AmeriCorps. There's a place for that person who will want to give to human service and to be able to do both. But you're absolutely right. This is just going to be a reflection of their tendencies and preferences and traits. It's not going to be an objective evaluation of what they can really do. It's just given their preferences.
I hate to even ask this question, but our conference theme is clergy abuse. And you had a good illustration in there of a search committee selecting a pastor using this tool. And you have a lot of familiarity with various tools. One of my concerns when we talk about clergy abuse is there some markers? Is there some way to identify, maybe not that somebody's going to do something specific, but that somebody is not healthy, that is going in considering ministry? Is there anything in this assessment or other assessments that would give predictive factors to a church or to everyone?
Well, Dr. Hancock gave us, when I was in Hardin-Simmons, was it the California profile or California?
CPI.
Yeah, and that I always remember that because of the odd questions it asked. And I hope my memory's right, but I think it was, can you start and stop your own urine? Do you prefer tall women? Would you rather go to the burn ward or to the park? I mean, those are the kinds of questions.
Yeah.
And I suspect that kind of assessment might get closer at.
These would not.
Right, this would not. This is purely vocational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just concerned we're all grieving about last night's presentation. This terrible grieving thing. But we got to think about prevention. Yes. And I don't know how quite to do that.
The only place that this indicates any kind of counseling issue would be when what's called a balance deficiency. So when you have people take the assessment, let's say they come back in a given paradox, they score below a 4 or 3 in both categories. We're trained to ask the question, has something happened to you in the last year or two that would cause you to show up this way? But that is really kind of beyond the intent of the assessment, right? I do ask it because I feel ethically responsible to know if they're showing up that way, but it's not going to give me any indication. I would be worried if I saw somebody with extremely low assertiveness and extremely low frankness, and this might be a person that might potentially be more vulnerable, but now I'm exceeding really the mandate of the assessment. So
One of the struggles that we have with dealing with this topic is the issue of power.
yes,
Is there any indication, character indicators,
Yes.
anything like that, that kind of, maybe you mentioned the thing about boundary, not what to do about.
there's a flashing red light that we call CAFER, and CAFER is when people show up with high preferences for these traits: certainty, assertive, risking, enforcing, and frankness. And so if a person is like a 9 or 10 on those 5 traits, that doesn't mean that they're a bad person, okay? But it just means that's not a person I would want for my pastoral caregiver or the CEO of my business, because if I completely believe in my opinion and I always set my own needs and I'm always to the point and I'm willing to risk the farm and I'm willing to hold you accountable, you know, that reminds me of some people you can think of maybe in public life. But anyway, those are not, to me, that is a danger thing, and they do train you for that. But, you know, I did meet a young man who that presented that way, and there was no evil motive. He was a baseball coach. His pure motivation was, I just want my kids to do it correctly, right? Well, but he's going to need an assistant coach who can balance all of those very dominant traits. So I don't want to take too much time. So.
Well, we conclude at 10:15.
Okay.
So the dangerously high or the dangerously low or the interesting combinations could be the red flag. Grandiosity or that certainty or...
But I think we'd use a whole different tool to do what's being asked here. That'd be beyond my...
Well, the Southwestern Seminary did the MMPI when I was there, but then they switched to the California, didn't they? Or when Clint and I was there, didn't he make that move to California? Not to California, but to that inventory. You know, Jeter, do you recall?
I don't.
Well, assessments to me are fascinating, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.